Hey guys, tonight we're climbing down into the airless tar black hold of a pirate galley called the Wider, 300 tons of former slave ship turned floating democracy, somewhere off the crooked elbow of Cape Cod on the night of April 26, 1717. Tonight we're settling in among roughly 146 sleeping men, one ship's belle that is about to outlive every single one of them, and a sky over Massachusetts that's turning the colour of a fresh bruise. We're talking about a captured slave ship worth what would be well over $100 million today, a self-elected pirate captain barely 28 years old, and a storm violent enough that ministers in Boston were still writing sermons about it years later. Welcome aboard the Wider galley, somewhere between the Bahamas she was stolen in and the sand dunes of Wellfleet she's about to die on what is about to become one of the worst nights in New England maritime history. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe let a fan hum somewhere in the room, low and steady, the way wind hums through rigging before it's decided to become a problem. You're warm right now. You're dry right now. Neither of those things is going to stay true for the men we're about to spend the night with. So get comfortable, get cozy, and let's ease down into tonight's hold together. Descend far enough into a wooden ship, and the first thing you notice isn't the dark. It's the smell. Tar, first, thick and resinous. The same stuff they've slathered over every seam of rope and timber to keep the Atlantic on the correct side of the hull. Under that, bilge water, a standing brew of seawater, rat droppings, spoiled food, and whatever 140 some men have failed to keep in their stomachs on a rolling sea. All of it sloshing a few feet beneath the deck boards you're trying to sleep on. Under that, and this is the part nobody warns you about, is the ghost of cargo that isn't there anymore. The Wider was built to carry enslaved people across the Atlantic, and even stripped of her irons and her false decks, timber holds a smell the way a bruise holds a colour. You'll get used to it. That's the frightening part, you always do. You've been assigned a spot near the mainmast step, which sounds like poor real estate until you learn that everyone's spot is poor real estate. There is no good spot. The Wider was designed to move 300 tons of trade goods and human cargo at speed, not to sleep 150 pirates in comfort. And right now she's carrying both her original purposes' leftover architecture and her new one's plunder, bolts of cloth, sacks of sugar, elephant tusks still faintly smelling of Africa. And somewhere below your feet, according to the men who helped stow it, more than 180 canvas bags of coin, each one supposedly weighing about 50 pounds, wedged into whatever gaps the ship's carpenter could find. You are, in other words, trying to fall asleep on top of what may be one of the largest hauls of pirate treasure in recorded history, and it is doing exactly nothing for your comfort. A modern airline would call this a checked baggage fee nightmare. Nobody here has invented that joke yet. Give it 300 years. Here's the thing about a pirate hammock. It's not actually a bad piece of engineering. Slung fore and aft, it swings with the roll of the ship instead of against it, which spares your ribs a beating that a fixed bunk would deliver every single wave. The problem isn't the hammock. The problem is that there are roughly 146 of you, and nowhere near 146 hammocks worth of space. So you sleep in shifts, what the men on deck call watch and watch, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock, forever, for as long as you're a pirate. The hammock you're borrowing right now still holds the warmth of the man who had it before you. You try not to think too hard about that. You fail. Somewhere near you, working by the light of a single shielded lantern, because open flame below decks on a ship carrying gunpowder is a genuinely terrible idea. A Welsh carpenter named Thomas Davis is running a hand along a seam in the hull, checking it the way a man checks a tooth he's worried about. Davis didn't volunteer for this life. He was taken off a captured sloop months back, because a ship this size and a fleet this size, 5 vessels under Bellamy's command by this spring, always needs more hands that know timber, and a carpenter's skills are too valuable to let walk away with the rest of a captured crew. He has a habit of tapping twice on any plank he trusts, and 3 times on any plank he doesn't, a private code nobody asked him to explain, and everybody has started listening for anyway. Right now, in the last ordinary hour before everything changes, he's tapping twice. Remember that. It matters later. By your third night aboard, you understand something that surprised you when you first signed on. This ship runs on paperwork, actual physical paperwork, a document called the ship's articles, drawn up and agreed to by vote before anyone weighs anchor, spelling out exactly how prizes get divided, exactly what happens if a man loses a leg or an eye in a fight, exactly how disputes get settled and by whom. Every man aboard, forced or free, has put his mark to it. The captain you serve under, a Devon-born Englishman not yet 30 named Samuel Bellamy, didn't appoint himself. The crew voted him in, the same way they can vote him out, the same way they voted out the captain before him for refusing to attack English shipping. On a King's Navy vessel, a man can be flogged bloody for grumbling at an officer. Here, grumbling gets you a hearing. It is, by the standards of 1717, a genuinely radical way to run a ship, and it is the reason so many of the men snoring around you right now, including some who escaped slavery to be here, chose this hold over almost anywhere else in the Atlantic world they could have ended up. Hold that thought too. We'll need it before the night is through. Communication between the fleet's 5 ships, on a night without radio or reliable long-range signalling, comes down to lanterns and proximity, an unglamorous, entirely analog system that works fine in clear weather and fails completely the moment fog or dark separates the vessels by more than a few hundred yards. Standing orders call for each ship to hang a signal lantern at a specified position after dark, bright enough for a lookout on a neighbouring vessel to confirm she's still holding station, and for a second, different pattern of light to be shown if a ship needs to warn the others of trouble ahead. It's a system built on the assumption that visibility will hold. Nobody aboard tonight has any particular reason to doubt that assumption. The fleet has sailed together for months this way without serious incident. 5 ships keeping loose company across open water, checking in with nothing more sophisticated than burning oil and a trained eye. You'll have cause to think about those lanterns again before this voyage is through. And not fondly. Here's what nobody tells new hands, though. Paperwork doesn't stop rats. The Wider's hold is infested with them. Fat grey commuters who've learnt every gap in the cargo and every unguarded biscuit bag. And at night, in the dark, you can hear them working the timbers a few feet from your ear. Sailors up and down the Atlantic coast swap the same grim joke about rats and ships, that a vessel too infested to save its own biscuit is somehow still expected to save its crew. You'll hear worse jokes than that tonight. You'll also, before this is over, wish rats were the worst thing sharing this hold with you. Hunger has its own rhythm down here, and it's not the rhythm you expected. Picture this: you signed on half imagining a pirate's table groaning with stolen delicacies, and what you actually got is salt pork gone the colour of old rope, and ship's biscuit hard enough to double as ballast, both of it shared out by a vote-appointed quartermaster rather than doled out at a captain's whim. That's not a small distinction. On a Royal Navy vessel, rations are a matter of rank. Officers eat well, hands eat what's left. Aboard a pirate ship, at least on paper, everyone from the captain to the powder monkey draws from the same barrel, checked by a quartermaster whose entire job is to make sure nobody, including the captain, shorts the crew. The biscuit still comes riddled with weevils. Democracy doesn't kill insects. Men have their own grim shorthand for it. Tap it on the table first, they say, so at least you know what you're eating before it starts moving on its own. It's not a joke so much as it's advice, but by now you've stopped being able to tell the difference. Here's what the vote actually protects, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we move on. No complete copy of the Wider's own written article survives today, but from surviving testimony given by her crew after the fact, we know she operated on the same broad system used across pirate crews of this era. A signed contract dividing every prize by an agreed scale of shares, with a fixed, non-negotiable payout if a man lost an eye, a hand, or a leg in the taking of it. It sounds almost bureaucratic for men supposedly living outside every law that mattered, and that's exactly the point. A merchant sailor maimed in service to the crown might get nothing but a discharge and a beggar's corner. A pirate maimed under articles like these had, in writing, a guaranteed sum waiting for him, not enough to make losing a leg worth it, nobody's pretending that, but enough that the loss wasn't simply his problem to carry alone. It is, by any honest measure, one of the only workplace injury policies available to a working sailor anywhere in the Atlantic world in 1717. The bad news is, you still might lose the leg. The good news, such as it is that the men around you actually wrote down what they owed you for it. Here's how the vote for captain actually worked. In the practical, unglamorous mechanics almost nobody explains when they tell this story. Any man aboard could stand for the position. Any man aboard got an equal voice regardless of rank or nationality. And the count was conducted openly enough that no one could credibly dispute the result afterward. It's not democracy in the modern sense. Nobody's pretending a pirate ship in 1717 extended equal say to every person it encountered. And the men who joined this crew under duress rarely got the luxury of declining to participate in votes that governed lives they hadn't chosen. But among the men who did hold a voice, the system worked with a consistency that would have surprised plenty of gentlemen back in London who assumed piracy meant simple anarchy. Bellamy himself could be deposed by exactly the same process that elevated him, a fact every man aboard understood and that, by most accounts, kept his authority considerably more accountable to the crew's actual wishes than any Royal Navy captain's ever was to his own men. You've watched it work first-hand, twice now, in disputes far smaller than a captaincy. It's part of why, whatever else this hold costs you in comfort, you haven't once seriously regretted signing your mark to those articles. Word travels strangely in a ship's hold, not top-down, the way you'd expect from a strict chain of command, but sideways, mouth to mouth. The way it would have travelled through any small, isolated community forced to share close quarters. Sometime past the second watch, a lookout named, call him what you like, the men rotate too fast for most names to stick to memory. Comes down the companionway with news from the deck. Another sail's been sighted to the south, low in the water, riding the swell the way a ship does when she's carrying cargo worth taking. It's the kind of second-hand news that used to arrive at farmhouses by way of a neighbour coming in from the fields, and it arrives here the same way. Filtered through whoever happened to be topside when it mattered. By morning, everyone below decks will know it as fact. A pink out of Boston, bound for New York, heavy with Madeira wine, and Bellamy's already given the order to run her down. You won't know until later that this ship, the one the men are already calling the Mary Ann, is going to matter a great deal more to this story than a routine capture has any right to. Sailors carry their own superstitions the way carpenters carry nails, always on hand, rarely examined too closely. Whistling on deck, more than one old hand will tell you with total seriousness, calls up wind you don't want, and given what's about to happen to this ship. A modern listener might be forgiven for wondering whether somebody, somewhere, whistled a tune they shouldn't have. Nobody aboard the Wider tonight believes the storm bearing down on them is the fault of a tune. But the superstition persists anyway, passed hand to hand the way all shipboard folklore is, because on a wooden vessel 300 miles from the nearest doctor. A little ritual caution costs nothing, and might, in some men's minds, buy something. You'll notice, before the night is through, that even rituals meant to ward off disaster have a way of feeling thinner once disaster actually arrives. There's a dampness down here that never fully leaves, and it's worth naming plainly rather than just gesturing at rough conditions, because the specifics are what make it real. Seawater works its way through even a well-corked hull, pooling in the bilge and wicking up into anything stored low, clothing, bedding, the wool blankets men brought aboard from whatever life they had before this one. Damp wool against skin for weeks at a stretch is a near guarantee of skin complaints and worse. Sailors of the period called the resulting rashes and sores by half a dozen folk names, and ship surgeons, where a crew was lucky enough to have one, treated them with whatever tar-based salve was on hand, because tar was cheap, available, and at least did something. Scurvy is the disease everyone's heard of, the one that rots gums and loosens teeth over long ocean crossings when fresh food runs out. And it remains genuinely terrifying, but the Wider's crew, raiding a coastline dense with prize ships and provisioning ports, rarely sailed far enough from resupply to let it take full hold the way it did on longer Royal Navy or East India voyages. What gets you here, more often, is smaller and duller. The cough that doesn't go away, the joint ache that damp and cold make worse, the general slow grinding down of a body that never gets a truly dry night's sleep. Nobody warns you about that part when they're recruiting. The pirate flag doesn't come with a health disclosure form. And yet, here's the part worth sitting with. Because it's easy to let the misery crowd out everything else, this ship, damp and cramped and reeking as she is, holds men who chose her over the alternatives available to them. And for some of them the choice wasn't close. A merchant sailor of this period could expect brutal discipline, unpaid wages withheld at a captain's pleasure, and a share of a voyage's profits measured in single digits if he saw any at all. A pirate crew's articles, patchy as their surviving record is, guaranteed something closer to an equal share for an equal risk, decided by vote, enforced by a quartermaster whose entire function was to check the captain's power rather than extend it. For the handful of men aboard who came to this ship after escaping enslavement, and Bellamy's crew by multiple accounts included men of African and indigenous descent who had found, on a pirate deck, a status the legal Atlantic world would never have offered them. That difference wasn't philosophical. It was the difference between being cargo and being crew. None of that makes the damp any less damp, or the biscuit any less full of weevils. But it's the reason this particular hold, on this particular ship, holds men who are here on purpose, and that's not nothing. By the time you've been aboard a full month, you've learned to sleep through the ordinary chaos, the creak of the mainmast working in its step, the distant slap of the ship's boy checking the pumps, the low murmur of men on the watch above trading stories about ports they'll never see again. What you haven't learned to sleep through, not yet, not ever really, is the particular quiet that comes right before weather turns. Right now, this second, above you on deck, that quiet has just arrived. The air has gone still and thick, the way it does before a slap. Nobody below decks knows it yet. You're about to. 3 weeks out from the last real prize taken, a wine-laden vessel called the Mary Ann, seized just that same morning off the Massachusetts coast, the fleet has scattered in fog thick enough to swallow ships whole. Somewhere out there in that grey soup are your consorts. Right now, in this hold, in this hammock, none of that has reached you yet. You're just a man trying to sleep on a stolen fortune, listening to a carpenter tap twice on a plank he trusts, in the last quiet hour of a ship that has, by the most careful modern counts, somewhere between 6 and 8 hours left to exist. What happens on deck after dark tonight is a different matter, but that's not yet. For now, close your eyes. The tapping will keep going a little longer. The men who built this ship never imagined it ending up here, and that, as it turns out, is exactly where our story has to begin. Before there was a hold to sleep in, there was a ship built for an entirely different kind of cargo, and to understand the storm bearing down on her. You first have to understand what she was built to be, and what it cost the men who stole her to make her something else. Captain Lawrence Prince stood on the quarterdeck of the Wider galley in the windward passage between Hispaniola and Cuba in late February of 1717, and watched 2 pirate sloops close on him from either quarter with the patient certainty of wolves who already know how the hunt ends. He had been at sea in this ship for the better part of a year, on a voyage that had already taken him from London to the West African coast to the Caribbean and back toward home, and he had every reason to expect he'd make it the rest of the way. The Wider was, by 1716 standards, close to state-of-the-art, a purpose-built galley frigate, 300 tons burthen, roughly 110 feet stem to stern, rigged for speed under sail but fitted with oars as well, capable of a genuinely impressive 13 knots when conditions favoured her. She'd been laid down in London in 1715, for a syndicate led by Sir Humphrey Morris, a slave-trading merchant and Member of Parliament, and launched the following year with a single brutal purpose: to move enslaved people across the Atlantic faster and more profitably than her competitors. This is the story of the Wider Galley, the fastest slave ship money could build, and the pirate flagship her theft would turn her into. Her name told you exactly what she was for. Ouidah, on the coast of what is now Benin, was one of the busiest slave trading ports in West Africa, and Morris's syndicate named their new galley after it, the way a shipping company today might name a tanker after the oil field it was built to drain. On her maiden voyage, the Wider had crossed to the West African coast, taken on her human cargo, and sailed the Middle Passage to Jamaica, where, according to the surviving trade records, more than 300 enslaved Africans were sold off her decks before she'd even reached the halfway point of her intended voyage. She then loaded a return cargo for London, sugar, indigo, ivory, and a hold full of gold and silver bullion, along with quicksilver and other trade goods valuable enough to justify a purpose-built galley's speed over a slower, cheaper hull, and turned north for home. It's worth sitting with that order of events for a moment. The same 18 guns bolted to her rails to deter pirates on the way home had been, days earlier, part of a ship whose entire architecture existed to hold other human beings against their will. The horror doesn't cancel out, because a different horror follows it. It just changes shape. Picture what state-of-the-art actually meant for a slaver in 1716, because the engineering detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Most merchant ships of the period relied entirely on wind, which meant that on a becalmed day in the mid-Atlantic, and the mid-Atlantic produces plenty of becalmed days, a ship simply sat, burning through provisions and for a slaving vessel, watching mortality among the enslaved people chained below decks climb with every windless hour. A galley design like the Wider's solved that problem with brute force, banks of oars that let the crew row the ship forward regardless of wind, shaving days off a crossing that could otherwise stretch into deadly weeks. Speed, for Sir Humphrey Morris's syndicate, wasn't a luxury feature. It was the entire business model, calculated in the coldest possible terms. Fewer days at sea meant fewer enslaved people lost to disease and starvation before they reached a market where they could be sold. The same 13-knot hull that let Bellamy's crew outrun a Royal Navy patrol 2 years later had been engineered, first and foremost, to minimise the human cost of maximising a slave trader's profit margin. There's no joke that belongs anywhere near that fact. We're not going to reach for one. Captain Prince had reason to be confident about outrunning trouble. His pursuers, a sloop called the Sultana, and another under a captain the crews would come to know as Bellamy, were smaller, lighter vessels, exactly the kind of thing a well-armed, well-built galley frigate should be able to shrug off or outgun. For 3 days, Prince tried. The chase ran through the Windward Passage under a Caribbean sun, the Wider using every knot of her advertised speed, the 2 sloops refusing to fall back, until finally, with nowhere left to run and no reinforcement in sight. Prince did the math every merchant captain of the era eventually has to do. 18 guns against 2 determined crews with nothing to lose, versus the survival of every man aboard, including his own. According to the accounts that survive, the engagement ended with a single shot fired across the Wider's bow. 1 shot. Prince struck his colours. What happened next tells you almost everything you need to know about how piracy actually worked, as opposed to how it's often imagined. Bellamy didn't maroon Prince, and he didn't kill him. Instead, in a negotiation that reads more like a slightly hostile business transaction than a massacre, Bellamy offered Prince the Sultana, the smaller sloop he'd been sailing before he needed something bigger, in exchange for keeping the Wider. Prince, whose sole legal obligation at that point was to preserve as much of his employer's interests as circumstances allowed, took the trade. He sailed the Sultana home to report the loss. Bellamy's crew, meanwhile, spent the following days doing something that would have horrified Sir Humphrey Morris even more than the theft itself. They refitted his slave ship into a warship. Carpenters tore out the captain's cabin to lower the vessel's centre of gravity and make her less top-heavy under a heavier gunload. Gunners hauled additional cannon aboard until she carried something in the neighbourhood of 28 active guns, up from her original 18, with reports of still more stowed below as ballast. In the space of about a week, the fastest slave ship on the Atlantic had become the fastest pirate ship on the Atlantic, crewed largely by men who had themselves been forced into service one way or another, and Sir Humphrey Maurice's investment was never going home. Here's the detail that ought to stop you cold though, and it's not a joke, so we're not going to make one. Somewhere in that refit, in the hold where enslaved people had been chained only months before, pirate crewmen, some of them formerly enslaved themselves, having joined pirate crews as free men entitled to a vote and a share, a status almost nowhere else in the Atlantic world would have offered them, were now stowing their own hammocks and their own sea chests. The same architecture that had been built to strip men of their humanity was, for a brief and strange stretch of history, housing men who had more say over their own fate under a pirate flag than they'd ever had under a legal one. It doesn't undo what the Wider was built for. Nothing could. But it's the kind of detail that makes this ship's short second life worth paying attention to, rather than just another entry in a long list of vessels that sank. By the time Bellamy took formal command, the crew's own vote, not a royal commission, made him captain, the same democratic process that had put him in charge of his previous ship after the men mutinied against a captain who wouldn't attack English shipping. The Wider was already the flagship of a small fleet. She sailed in company with a sloop called the Mary Ann, another prize called the Mary Ann, and additional vessels that came and went as prizes were taken and released throughout that spring. Bellamy set a course north and west, up out of the Caribbean along the American coast, and by most careful counts he and his crew took somewhere in the range of 50 ships or more over the roughly 1 year his career as a captain lasted, an astonishing number for so short a run, and one of the reasons some later reckonings would name him among the wealthiest pirates in recorded history. His estimated haul equivalent to well over $100 million in modern terms. None of that money would ever reach a bank. Almost none of the men who helped take it would live to spend it. Sir Humphrey Morris, the London merchant and sitting member of Parliament whose syndicate had commissioned the Wider in the first place, was no small operator in this trade. He was, by the 1720s, one of the most active slave traders in England, later serving as a director of the Bank of England before a spectacular financial collapse and forgery scandal. Unrelated to this ship. Ended his career in disgrace years after the Wider herself was already gone. The loss of a single vessel, however valuable, was a business risk men like Maurice had long since learned to absorb. Transatlantic slaving voyages of this scale were insured, financed, and diversified precisely so that no single capture, however dramatic, could meaningfully threaten the underlying enterprise. Bellamy's crew stole an extraordinary prize that February. They did not meaningfully dent the system that had built her. That's a harder, less satisfying fact than the Robin Hood framing usually allows for. And it's worth saying plainly, rather than skating past it. Command of a pirate fleet, it turns out, was never really a one-man job, and the men who filled the roles around Bellamy tell you almost as much about how this operation functioned as Bellamy himself does. Nassau, the ramshackle harbour town on New Providence in the Bahamas, was where much of this operation was actually headquartered in its early days, a place contemporaries only half-jokingly called the Republic of Pirates, functioning as a genuine if lawless community complete with its own rough hierarchy of captains, its own trade in captured goods, and its own periodic disputes, settled the same way disputes got settled aboard any individual ship, by vote and by force in roughly that order of preference. It was a temporary, transient settlement, rather than anything resembling a permanent town. No farms, no families in any lasting sense. Just captured wealth passing through fast on its way to being spent, gambled or drunk before the next voyage began. It's from that same loose, floating community that most of the era's most famous pirate captains, Bellamy included, drew their crews, their consorts, and their reputations. His quartermaster through much of this run was a man named Palsgrave Williams, a former New England goldsmith turned pirate who eventually received his own consort ship, the Marianne, to command outright, proof that the fleet's command structure was less a pyramid with Bellamy alone at the top, and more a rotating set of earned commissions, each one voted on, each one revocable. Later, as more prizes came in that April, a former Hornigold hand named Richard Noland took up the quartermaster's post and was in turn given his own prize to captain, the Anne Galley. A modern audience might recognise the shape of this arrangement more easily than an 18th century one would have, less a monarchy, more a loose partnership with a rotating executive team, all of it accountable to a crew that could and did depose leadership it, judged unfit. It's also, incidentally, where Bellamy's nickname comes from. Cape Cod folklore remembers him as Black Sam, supposedly for wearing his own dark hair tied back in a ribbon instead of a powdered wig, and his crew are said to have called themselves Robin Hood's Men, a reputation built partly on real acts of mercy toward captured crews, and partly, it has to be said, on the dramatised retelling of a London writer named Charles Johnson, whose 1724 A General History of the Pirates is the source of nearly every colourful quotation attributed to Bellamy, including a famous speech about being a free prince answerable to no one. Johnson's book is a genuinely foundational source for this entire era of piracy, and also one whose authorship is disputed and whose dramatic flourishes historians have never fully been able to separate from the documented record. Treat Bellamy's most quotable lines the way you'd treat a viral quote attributed to a historical figure online, probably rooted in something real. Almost certainly polished well past what anyone actually said. For now, in the last days of April 1717, the Wider Galley is a fast, heavily armed, deeply overloaded ship running up the coast of colonial Massachusetts with a captain barely 28 years old, a crew of somewhere close to 146 men, and a hold full of stolen fortune she was never built to carry. She has survived a 3-day chase, a total refit, and roughly a year of raiding 200 miles of ocean. She has 3 more days left. What she doesn't have, what nobody aboard her has, not the captain, not the quartermaster, not the carpenter tapping twice on trusted planks, is any idea that the ship that made her famous crew rich is about to make them all a footnote in New England history instead. The Robin Hood reputation, disputed as its exact wording may be, wasn't invented from nothing. According to Johnson's account, again our best and only detailed narrative source, and one to read with appropriate skepticism about specific dialogue, Bellamy captured a small sloop belonging to a Boston area captain that spring, stripped it of anything genuinely useful, and then let the captain go rather than sinking the vessel or forcing its crew into service. Addressing him with something to the effect of scorning to do any honest man a mischief unless his own crew's necessities required it. Whether those precise words were ever spoken is impossible to verify. What is more broadly consistent across the surviving record, though, is a pattern. Captured crews who cooperated tended to be released with at least part of their vessel intact, while captured cargo, money, arms, provisions, anything of real value to the fleet, was taken without much ceremony. It's a distinction that separates Bellamy's operation from simple indiscriminate violence, even as it does nothing to soften what was, at bottom, organised theft on the high seas, funded by a slave ship's stolen cargo and carried out at gunpoint. Both things can be true. History rarely hands you a figure who's simply one or the other. By April of 1717, that pattern had repeated itself across roughly 50 captured vessels, sloops, snows, pinks and merchantmen, taken up and down a stretch of coastline running from the Caribbean through the Carolinas and into New England waters, a run that made Bellamy, in barely a year, one of the most successful pirate captains of the entire Golden Age by sheer volume of plunder. The fleet itself kept shifting shape as ships were taken, crewed, released or absorbed. At various points it included the Wider, the Marianne, the Marianne, the Anne, and a vessel called the Fisher, sailing in loose company rather than tight formation, scattering and regrouping as weather and opportunity dictated. That loose formation is going to matter enormously in about 72 hours, when fog off the Massachusetts coast does what fog always eventually does to a fleet without radio or reliable signal lanterns. It pulls the ships apart from each other at exactly the moment they'll need each other most. The theft of a slave ship built her a second life as a pirate's fortune. What she still hadn't survived was Cape Cod, and to understand how she ended up in its path at all, you have to spend one more day aboard her, the very last ordinary one she had. You wake before dawn to a sound every sailor learns to recognize in his sleep before he recognizes anything else. The particular double thump of bare feet crossing the deck at a run, which means somebody's seen something worth running for. Above you, muffled through the deck boards, a voice is calling down the news the way news always travels on this ship, fast, unofficial, and everyone's business at once. Sail, off the larboard bow. You're up the companionway before you've fully decided to move, and there she is, a broad-sterned merchant vessel out of Boston, riding low and slow under a grey morning sky, exactly the kind of unhurried, undermanned target Bellamy's fleet has built its entire reputation on catching. It's April 26th, 1717, though nobody aboard is thinking about the date, and the chase that follows is almost disappointingly brief. The Wider, with her galley frigate speed and her 28 guns run out for effect rather than necessity, closes the distance in under an hour. There's no real fight in it, the merchant captain. A man later identified in court records as sailing a vessel called the Mary Ann understands the arithmetic the moment he sees what's bearing down on him, and strikes his colours rather than force a confrontation his unarmed crew has no chance of winning. Congratulations, you've lost count, honestly, somewhere north of 50 ships this past year. And one more merchant vessel surrendering without a shot barely registers as an event. What makes this particular capture different won't become obvious for another 12 hours. Here's what actually gets seized. Not gold, not silver, but wine. The Mary Ann is carrying a cargo of Madeira, casks of it, the fortified stuff that travels well across an ocean and sells for good money in a colonial market starved for anything stronger than small beer. Bellamy's boarding party finds the captain unwilling to serve as a pilot for the fleet's continued run up the coast. He refuses outright. According to the testimony that survives from this voyage, which is either principled defiance or simple self-preservation, and probably both. Bellamy's response is practical rather than vicious. He takes the captain and 5 of his crew prisoner aboard the Wider, and sends 7 of his own men across to sail the Mary Ann herself as a prize, with orders to keep close and follow the flagship's lead. It's a routine piece of fleet logistics. It is also, though nobody aboard either vessel could possibly know it yet, the single decision that will decide who lives to tell this story and who doesn't. One of the 7 men sent aboard the Mary Ann that morning is a ship's carpenter named Thomas South, not to be confused with the Wider's own carpenter, a different forced man entirely, because piracy in this era apparently ran on more conscripted carpenters than any single narrative can comfortably track. South had been pressed into this life the same way most of the fleet's skilled tradesmen were, taken off a captured vessel, because a fleet needs men who can fix a hull faster than it needs men who can merely fight. His consent never seriously asked for, his usefulness making refusal something closer to impossible. Standing now on the deck of a captured wine ship, instead of chained below decks or worse, South has already started doing the math every forced man aboard this fleet does eventually, quietly, without saying it aloud to anyone who might report it. How close to shore would this ship have to get, and how good a swimmer would a man need to be to simply not be here anymore when the sun came up? By mid-morning, the wine has done what a fresh cask of Madeira does to men who've spent months on hard salt rations and harder discipline. Testimony given later by one of the Mary Ann's prize crew would describe the men as having drank plentifully of the captured cargo, a phrase dry enough to have survived 2 lawyers and 3 centuries intact, and vivid enough that you don't need much imagination to fill in what it actually looked like. It's not hard to understand the impulse. These are men living a genuinely dangerous, genuinely uncertain life, and a full cask of good wine after a clean capture is about as close to an ordinary celebration as this crew ever gets. Here's the thing about celebrating on a ship, though, that a modern reader with the benefit of hindsight can see coming from several paragraphs away, Alcohol and vigilance have never once, in the entire history of sailing, made good shipmates. The men on the Mary Ann are not, by early afternoon, at their sharpest. Neither, in fairness, are plenty of the men still aboard the Wider. Weather doesn't care about anyone's hangover. By early afternoon, a fog starts rolling in off the water the way Cape Cod fog does. Not a wall so much as a slow, patient erasure, swallowing first the horizon, then the nearest ship, then eventually the length of your own bowsprit. Sailors on watch call the change down through the ship the same way news of the Mary Ann's capture travelled that morning, second-hand, deck to hold. One man relaying to the next what he's seen from his post. Visibility's dropping. The Mary Ann and the Anne have already gone hazy on the horizon, and Bellamy's given the order for all vessels to stay close and keep signal contact. It's a sensible order. It is also, by 4 o'clock that afternoon, according to the accounts that survive, essentially impossible to obey. The fog by then has gone from thick to total, thick enough that ships sailing within shouting distance of each other lose visual contact entirely, and somewhere out in that grey nothing. The fleet that has sailed and raided together for the better part of a year quietly, invisibly, comes apart. The watch rotation doesn't stop for a capture, whatever the excitement above deck might suggest, and by midday you're back on your own schedule, 4 hours on and 4 off, same as any ordinary day, except that today the men coming off watch bring stories with them instead of just weather reports. One hand describes the Mary Ann's captain's face at the exact moment he understood there was no outrunning the Wider, a specific, almost pitying kind of resignation that the storyteller does a fairly unkind impression of. And the mess around him laughs harder than the impression really deserves, the particular overloud laughter of men who've spent a year doing this and never quite gotten. Used to how easy it still sometimes is. Not every capture goes this smoothly. You've heard the stories about the ones that didn't. Burned ships, resisting crews, outcomes considerably less tidy than a single shot across a bow, and a captain who knows when he's beaten. Today isn't one of those days. Nobody aboard yet knows it's about to become a different kind of bad day entirely. Below decks aboard the Wider, the 6 prisoners taken off the Mary Ann that morning are getting a lesson in exactly how this crew treats a captured man who isn't fighting back. Here's the thing worth noting. Because it cuts against almost every cinematic version of piracy you've absorbed without meaning to, nobody's clapping them in irons in some dank corner. They're fed the same salt pork and weevil-riddled biscuit everyone else aboard is eating, housed in whatever space the overcrowded hold can spare, and treated, by the standards of the era, with something close to bureaucratic indifference rather than cruelty. That's not generosity so much as its incentive. A captured captain who can be released relatively unharmed is a captured captain whose report back to colonial authorities carries less weight, whose testimony sounds less like an atrocity and more like an inconvenience. It is in its own grim way a functioning system, mercy as strategy, kept honest by the same crew accountability that governs everything else aboard this ship. One of the 6 prisoners, according to later testimony, spends the day quietly observing everything, how the watches rotate, how orders get relayed, how a crew this large somehow avoids the chaos he half expected. He'll have plenty of time to think about what he saw. He, at least, is going to survive the night. The articles aren't just theory on a ship like this. They get invoked, argued over, and settled in the space of an afternoon, the same way any small, isolated community handles its disputes when there's no higher court to appeal to. A disagreement breaks out that same day over how the captured Madeira ought to be divided against the fleet's existing stores. A small thing, in the scheme of 50 captured ships and a fortune in coin, but the kind of small thing that curdles fast in close quarters if it isn't handled. Rather than Bellamy simply ruling on it, the matter goes, as the articles dictate, to a broader vote among the men with a stake in the outcome, mediated by the quartermaster, whose entire function exists precisely for moments like this. It's a slow, unglamorous, almost tedious process. Nothing like the swift captain's word is law discipline of a naval vessel, and that's exactly the point of it. Here's what nobody tells you about pirate democracy going in. It's not chaos. It's paperwork with cutlasses nearby, in case the paperwork fails. Today, it doesn't fail. Today, the vote holds, the wine gets divided, and the fleet sails on. Tonight is going to test whether anything else about this crew holds as well. As the light fails, the wind that started as a mere shift by early evening keeps building, and the old hands start doing what old hands always do when weather turns wrong, reading the sky the way a man reads a face he doesn't quite trust. Someone recalls, half joking, half not, the superstition about whistling up wind you don't want, a joke that's landed differently every hour since the fog first rolled in, and by full dark it isn't landing as a joke at all. By 8 o'clock, the swells have grown noticeably, the kind of long, deep roll that makes even a heavily laden 300-ton galley feel suddenly uncomfortably small. Word passes below decks the way it always does here, not from officer to crew in a clean chain of command, but sideways, hand to hand, watch to watch. Each man telling the next what he's seen or heard from someone who saw it firsthand. Weather's turning ugly. The word goes. Keep close to the coast. Nobody below decks yet understands what close to the coast is about to mean for a ship sailing blind through fog and gathering dark toward a stretch of sandbar nobody aboard has ever charted. By the time you've been through enough prize takings to lose count, you understand that a pirate crew's real discipline doesn't show up in the boarding and the shouting, it shows up afterward, in the accounting. Every cask of wine, every coin, every yard of captured cloth gets logged, at least loosely, against the day the fleet makes port and divides shares according to the articles every man aboard signed his mark to. It's not romantic. It's closer to bookkeeping than to swashbuckling, and that's rather the point. The vote-appointed quartermaster who tallies the Mary Ann's cargo tonight has exactly as much authority to challenge Bellamy's orders as Bellamy has to give them, and both men know it. That balance of power, invisible and unglamorous as it is the actual machinery holding this diverse transient. Frequently coerced crew together as something more than an armed mob. It's not affection that binds these men to each other. It's a contract, honestly kept, backed by a vote that actually means something. Here's what happens, though, when the weather stops caring about contracts. By early evening, the wind that carried the fog in starts doing something the fog alone never did, picking up. Not yet violent, just wrong, a shift in direction, a change in the smell of the air, the kind of thing an experienced hand notices in his gut before he could name it out loud. Somewhere out there in the gathering dark, Thomas South is standing on the deck of a prize ship crewed by 7 half-drunk pirates and 6 sullen prisoners, close enough to the Massachusetts shoreline, if the charts are anything close to right, that a strong swimmer might actually make it. He hasn't decided yet. He has maybe 6 hours left to. You knew South a little before he was reassigned to the prize crew. He was the one who fixed the split seam near your hammock 2 nights back, working by lantern light, tapping the wood the same careful way every ship's carpenter on this fleet seems to have picked up from somewhere, and he'd asked, while he worked, whether you had people waiting anywhere, the way men on this ship sometimes do when the wine's loosened the usual guardedness. You'd told him no, not really. He'd said he had a wife back in England he hadn't seen in going on 2 years. Said it flatly, the way a man says something he's decided not to feel too hard about anymore, and then gone back to tapping the plank until it satisfied him. You don't know, standing here now with the fog closing in, that the next time anyone speaks his name in connection with this voyage, it'll be inside a Boston courtroom, and somewhere north of him, invisible now in the fog and the coming dark, the wider galley is sailing on alone, carrying 146 men and a fortune in stolen coin toward a stretch of sandbar that has already, in a sense, been waiting for her the entire time. What happens below decks after dark tonight is the whole reason we're here, but before the wind finishes turning, it's worth stepping back from the deck of a captured wine ship to ask a harder question. Who was the man giving all these orders? And how did an English sailor barely into his late 20s end up commanding 5 ships and a fortune off the coast of a colony he'd never officially set foot in as anything but a stranger. In the summer of 1716, somewhere in the waters off the Bahamas, a crew of pirate sailors gathered on the deck of a captured sloop to do something no Royal Navy crew in the world would ever have been permitted to do: fire their own captain. Benjamin Hornigold, an experienced pirate who had helped establish the loose, lawless settlement at Nassau that men of this trade half-jokingly called the Republic of Pirates, had a rule his crew increasingly resented. He refused to attack English shipping, a scruple that made sense given his own nationality and made considerably less sense to a crew that watched profitable English prizes sail. Passed unmolested, month after month, while French and Spanish vessels alone were fair game. The dispute came to a vote, as disputes aboard a pirate ship generally did. Hornigold lost. A portion of the crew chose to stay loyal to him and sailed off to continue raiding under his more restrictive terms. The larger portion of the crew turned instead to a younger sailor who'd been serving under Hornigold and had, by every account, earned their confidence, a Devon-born Englishman not yet 30, remembered by history as Samuel Bellamy. This is the story of Bellamy, the only pirate captain of his era to reach real fame and real fortune, not through royal commission or inherited command, but through a crew's plain, deliberate vote, and the story of how completely, catastrophically fast that fortune came apart. Bellamy's early life survives only in fragments, and the fragments themselves don't fully agree. He was born, most accounts suggest, around February of 1689, in or near the Devon parish of Hittersley in southwestern England, though at least one competing tradition places his birth in London instead, the kind of unresolved detail that's common enough for an ordinary sailor of this period. Since nobody kept careful records of a fisherman's son on the assumption he might someday matter to history, what is better documented is that he went to sea young, apparently serving for a time with the Royal Navy as a teenager, learning the trade that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men ever to sail under a black flag. By around 1715, in his mid-20s, Bellamy had made his way to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. An ordinary sailor with no fortune, and according to persistent Cape Cod folklore that historians treat as legend rather than documented fact, a romance with a local woman named Maria Hallett, whom the stories remember as considerably above his station, and whom he supposedly promised to return to. Wealthy and respectable, before their story could properly begin. Whether or not Maria Hallett existed exactly as the folklore describes her, the ambition the legend assigns to Bellamy tracks with what actually happened next. Rather than settle for an ordinary sailor's wages, Bellamy partnered with a former Rhode Island goldsmith named Palsgrave Williams and sailed south toward Florida. Chasing rumours of Spanish treasure lost the previous year when a hurricane sank an entire homebound plate fleet off the Florida coast, a real historical wreck, extensively salvaged both by Spanish crews and by opportunistic wreckers from up and down the American coast. Bellamy and Williams arrived too late and too poorly equipped to claim any meaningful share of that particular fortune. Here's the dry joke this story basically writes itself. A man who would go on to become one of the wealthiest pirates in recorded history started his career by showing up late to somebody else's shipwreck. Failure, though, has a way of redirecting ambitious men rather than ending them, and rather than sail home broke, Bellamy and Williams turned instead toward the pirate haven of Nassau, and toward Benjamin Hornigold's crew. By the time the mutiny came, in the summer of 1716, Bellamy had spent perhaps a year learning the trade under Hornigold, enough time to prove himself capable, aggressive, and popular with the men whose confidence would eventually elect him. The vote that made him captain wasn't a hostile takeover in the sense a modern audience might picture. It was the system working exactly as the articles of this era's pirate crews generally intended, giving ordinary sailors real, binding authority over who led them and toward what targets. Williams, his partner from the failed Florida venture, received his own command, the sloop Marianne, and the two ships began operating in loose consort, a partnership that would persist through most of Bellamy's brief career. What followed was less a single dramatic robbery than a sustained, almost business-like run of successful raiding. Over the following months, Bellamy and his growing fleet worked the Caribbean and the shipping lanes leading toward it, developing the reputation for calculated mercy that would eventually earn him his most famous nickname. He became known, in the retelling at least, as Black Sam. Cape Cod folklore attributes this to his habit of wearing his own dark hair tied back with a simple ribbon, rather than the powdered wigs fashionable among gentlemen of the era, a small act of personal style that reads across 3 centuries as almost defiantly practical for a man whose job required climbing rigging in a hurry. He dressed, by multiple accounts, with real flair despite the practical hair, fine black velvet waistcoats, silk stockings, buckled shoes, and reportedly no fewer than 4 dueling pistols thrust through his sash at any given time, less a security measure than a walking advertisement of exactly how seriously he expected to be taken. His crew, per the era's most detailed narrative source, took to calling themselves Robin Hood's Men, and Bellamy himself the Prince of Pirates, nicknames built on a genuine pattern of releasing cooperative captured crews relatively unharmed, and inflated considerably further by that same narrative source's taste for a good story over a strictly accurate one. Bellamy's story only makes sense against the backdrop of a wider historical moment historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy, a relatively brief window running roughly from the 1650s through about 1730, with its most intense and most famous stretch concentrated in just the few years surrounding Bellamy's own career. The window opened, in large part, because of an accident of European politics. The end of the long War of the Spanish Succession in 1713 left thousands of trained sailors and privateers, men who had spent years legally raiding enemy shipping under wartime commission, suddenly unemployed, their skills intact, and their prospects for honest work considerably diminished in an oversupplied peacetime labour market. Nassau's loose pirate republic filled with exactly these men, former privateers with nowhere else to point a decade of hard-won naval experience, and Bellamy himself fits the pattern closely, a Royal Navy trained sailor who arrived on the American coast right around the moment that pattern was taking shape, and found in piracy. One of the only trades still willing to make full use of what the war had taught him. He wasn't an anomaly. He was, in many ways, entirely typical of his moment, just unusually good at it, and unusually well remembered for it, 3 centuries on. It's worth briefly comparing Bellamy's trajectory to the other pirate captain his career kept intersecting with, if only because the contrast tells you something about how differently this era's fame could shake out. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, took the opposite branch of the same road, building a reputation on deliberate theatrical terror rather than calculated mercy, reportedly weaving lit fuses into his beard before boarding action specifically to look as monstrous as possible to crews too frightened to resist. Blackbeard would go on to outlive Bellamy by more than 2 years, eventually dying in a ship-to-ship battle off North Carolina in 1718 rather than in a storm, his severed head famously displayed from a bowsprit as a warning to other pirates. Bellamy's own career burned faster, and, in its own way, brighter barely a year as captain, more wealth accumulated in that single year than Blackbeard ever gathered in his considerably longer run, and an ending that had nothing to do with cannon fire or betrayal, and everything to do with whether no reputation, however fearsome or however merciful, could out-negotiate. The mutiny itself deserves a slightly closer look, because the crew voted him in undersells how genuinely tense that moment on the sloop's deck must have been. Hornigold was not a man to be casually deposed. He had helped found the entire pirate settlement at Nassau, commanded real loyalty among a faction of his crew, and would go on, in fact, to eventually accept a royal pardon and end his career hunting his former colleagues as a government-sanctioned pirate hunter. A reversal that tells you something about how thin the line really was between this profession and its opposite. When the vote split the crew, it split unevenly. Hornigold sailed off with a minority still loyal to his caution regarding English targets, while the larger share threw in with Bellamy and, notably, with a younger sailor serving under Hornigold at the time named Edward Teach, who would soon enough make his own name as Blackbeard. 2 of the era's most famous pirates, in other words, stood on the losing side of the very same crew room argument that made Bellamy captain, before their careers diverged entirely. Teach toward the black flag and a fearsome, deliberately theatrical brand of terror. Bellamy toward the calculated mercy that would earn him a gentler legend and precisely the same fatal ending. It would be a disservice to the historical record, though, to let the Robin Hood framing stand entirely uncomplicated, because the surviving testimony from Bellamy's crew doesn't describe a captain who was gentle across the board. Uncooperative captains, by multiple accounts, fared considerably worse than the ones who struck their colours quickly and answered questions honestly. Vessels were sometimes burned rather than released, and crews who resisted or attempted to conceal cargo faced treatment considerably rougher than the folklore's Robin Hood branding would suggest. The mercy Bellamy extended was real, documented and consistent enough to earn him a reputation among sailors up and down the coast, but it was also transparently a tool of the trade rather than an unconditional virtue, extended to men who made themselves useful and withheld from men who didn't. His crew, meanwhile, reflected the genuinely international, genuinely mixed character of Atlantic piracy in this era far more than most popular retellings capture. Among the men who would eventually stand trial for sailing with him were sailors born in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in France, in Jamaica, and in New York, alongside Englishmen, Welshmen, at least one Mosquito Indian from the Central American coast, and formerly enslaved men of African descent who had found aboard this fleet a status nowhere else in the Atlantic world would extend to them. A pirate crew, whatever else it was rarely a homogeneous one. It's worth sitting for a moment with the uncomfortable tension sitting right at the centre of that Robin Hood reputation, because glossing past it would be dishonest. The fortune funding Bellamy's generosity toward captured merchant crews came, in no small part, from a stolen slave ship, the very wider galley whose theft this story has already traced, and from dozens of other vessels whose own cargo, in several documented instances, included enslaved people whom Bellamy's crew freed, and in some cases invited to join as free men under articles. He was simultaneously a beneficiary of the transatlantic slave trade's machinery, and, for a handful of individual men, an escape route out of it. Neither fact cancels the other. Both were true of the same ship, the same captain, very possibly the same afternoon. By February of 1717, that reputation and that growing fleet converged on the wider galley herself, chased down and captured in the Windward Passage in the 3-day pursuit already recounted. The single capture that would define the rest of Bellamy's short career and the entirety of his posthumous fame. With her 28 guns and her 13 knot hull, the wider gave Bellamy's fleet a flagship worthy of the reputation building around him, and over the 2 months that followed, he pushed that advantage as hard as any captain of the era ever had, taking prize after prize up through the Caribbean, past the Carolinas, and north along the American seaboard. A total haul that, by the most careful modern reckonings, likely exceeded 50 vessels across his entire year-long career and placed him, by some estimates of adjusted value, among the single wealthiest pirates who ever lived, a fortune worth well over $100 million in today's terms. None of it would outlive the month. By April of 1717, Bellamy's fleet had worked its way up the American seaboard from the Caribbean through the Carolinas and past New York, following the same well-worn shipping lanes merchant vessels used to move goods between colonial ports, which is exactly why those lanes made such profitable pirate hunting grounds. Cape Cod itself sat near the northern edge of that route, a hooked peninsula of sand dunes and shifting shoals that colonial navigators already respected as dangerous even with proper charts in hand, and that Bellamy's own navigator, whoever he was, appears to have been sailing through essentially blind. Whether Bellamy specifically intended to make port somewhere near the Cape that week, to see Maria Hallett, as the folklore insists, or simply to resupply and regroup before turning back south, remains genuinely unresolved in the historical record, and probably always will. What is certain is that on the afternoon of April 26th, with the Mary Ann freshly captured and the fleet already scattering in fog, the wider galley held a course that kept her close to an unfamiliar shore rather than standing well out to open. Safer water. That single navigational choice, whatever reasoning sat behind it, is the decision this entire story now turns on. As for Maria Hallett, the sweetheart the folklore insists Bellamy meant to return to, rich and respectable. Before piracy swallowed the plan entirely, Cape Cod tradition took her story somewhere considerably darker after the events of this same April. Local legend eventually recast her as the Witch of Wellfleet, a woman who, spurned or grieving or simply blamed by a community that needed somewhere to put its shock, was said in later folklore to have called up the very storm that killed the man who'd promised to come back for her. It's a vivid story, and it is exactly that, a story. Unsupported by any contemporary court record or eyewitness account, the kind of explanation communities reach for when a tragedy is too large and too sudden to accept as simple bad luck with weather. The more mundane, better supported explanation for why Bellamy's fleet was sailing so close to an unfamiliar and treacherous stretch of Cape Cod shoreline that night has nothing to do with witchcraft at all, and everything to do with fog, an untested coastline, and a navigator working without the benefit of charts anyone aboard had ever personally sailed before. Whichever explanation you find more satisfying, a curse or simple bad luck compounded by unfamiliar water, the outcome waiting at the end of April 26, 1717, doesn't change. Somewhere off Wellfleet, in the dark, a self-made pirate king elected by his own crew rather than crowned by any king was about to run out of luck, run out of coastline, and run out of time, all in the same handful of hours. The storm that's about to hit doesn't know or care how he got there. It only cares that he did. A curse is a story a community tells itself afterward, to make sense of a night that, as it actually unfolded from inside the ship, felt like nothing so tidy as fate. It felt like weather, and weather, as you're about to learn firsthand, doesn't need a reason. The wind has a different sound now than it did an hour ago, and you notice the change before you can name it, a shift from the steady. Almost companionable hum, it's held all evening into something with an edge to it. A thin high note working through the rigging above your head like a bow dragged too hard across a fiddle string. You're back in the hold, off watch, trying to get what sleep you can before your shift comes round again, and for the first few minutes, you tell yourself, this is just weather, the ordinary kind. The kind this fleet has sailed through a dozen times without losing so much as a spar. You're warm enough down here, wedged into a hammock that started swinging with more insistence than usual. That warmth is doing a great deal of work tonight, convincing you everything is fine. It won't be able to keep doing that much longer. By 9 o'clock, the swells have grown from the long, deep roll you noticed at dusk into something considerably more aggressive. A chop that slams the hull rather than simply lifting it, throwing loose gear across the deck above with a series of crashes that send more than one man below decks bolt upright in his hammock. Word comes down the companionway the way it always does on this ship. Deck to hold, man to man, all hands not on watch are wanted topside to help secure loose cargo before the weather gets worse. You haven't yet grasped that worse is doing enormous, almost dishonest work in that sentence. Modern meteorologists looking back at this exact storm, working from surviving accounts of wind and wave, have estimated gusts approaching 70 miles an hour and swells climbing toward 30 feet by the night's peak, figures that would qualify, by strength alone, as a Category 1 hurricane, even though the calendar says late April, weeks before the Atlantic hurricane season the modern world recognizes even begins, whatever this storm technically was. And historians still debate whether hurricane is the right word for an out-of-season nor'easter this violent, or whether it deserves its own category entirely. Nobody aboard the Wider that night is thinking about meteorological classification. They're thinking about the sacks of coin now sliding loose in the hold with every roll of the ship. 180 bags of 50 pounds apiece turning, in these conditions, from stolen fortune into genuine hazard. Here's the part that would be almost comic if it weren't so dangerous. The very treasure this crew spent a year accumulating is now actively working against them, shifting weight in a hull already riding low and heavy. Throwing off a balance the ship needs badly to survive what's coming. A man near you loses his footing on the slick, canting deck and goes down hard against a loose cask, and in the noise and the dark it takes a moment before anyone even notices he's hurt. This is the ship's articles doing exactly the grim, practical work they were written for, his share of tonight's chaos, if he survives it, includes a guaranteed payout for whatever this injury costs him. Small comfort at the moment. He'll take it anyway, once the pain lets him think that far ahead. The order comes down for every man not otherwise occupied to work the pumps, and you spend the better part of an hour in a rotation that has stopped feeling like work and started feeling like something closer to a heartbeat, pull, release. Pull, release, water rising through the ship's timbers faster than any crew of men, however determined, can reasonably keep ahead of. A galley frigate built for speed rather than heavy weather was never meant to take on water at this rate and simply shrug it off, and by now everyone working the pump handles alongside you understands, without anyone saying it aloud, that you're not actually winning this particular fight, you're only slowing how fast you lose it. Here's the closest thing to a joke anyone manages tonight, muttered by a man beside you whose name you never learned. At least the wine's already been drunk, so there's nothing left down there worth crying over losing. It gets half a laugh. Half a laugh tonight is doing an enormous amount of work. Somewhere in the rotation, your hands blistered raw against a pump handle you've been working for the better part of an hour. You find yourself doing the arithmetic every man on this crew signed up to accept the day he put his mark to the articles. A share of the risk, a share of the reward. No separate exemption for the nights the risk turns out to be larger than anyone bargained for. It's not a comforting thought, exactly, but there's something almost steadying in it anyway. You chose this. In whatever limited, complicated way a man in your position gets to choose anything, and the men beside you chose it too, and whatever's coming, you're at least facing it as something closer to equals than you'd have been on almost any other deck in the Atlantic world. That's cold comfort against 30-foot swells. It's still, somehow, comfort. Thomas Davis is working by lantern light again tonight. Same as every night, except the sound he's making has changed. Where 3 nights ago he tapped twice on planks he trusted, and 3 times on planks he didn't, tonight you notice something that turns your stomach before your mind fully catches up to why. He's tapping 3 times on nearly everything, seam after seam, plank after plank. The carpenter who spent this whole voyage quietly reassuring the men around him, without ever saying a reassuring word out loud, has run out of planks he trusts. He doesn't say anything to you directly. He doesn't have to. You've learnt his code well enough by now to read the sentence he isn't speaking, and it isn't a good one. The quartermaster, the same man whose entire job, in ordinary times, is checking the captain's power and keeping the crew's accounts honest, spends this stretch of the night doing something considerably less bureaucratic, moving through the ship in the dark, checking on men by name, redistributing what little dry clothing and rope can be spared to those who need it most. It's not in his job description, not exactly, but it's exactly the kind of task a crew's elected second in command ends up doing when a ship starts coming apart around him. Because somebody has to. And a title voted onto a man by his shipmates carries its own quiet expectation of showing up when it matters most. You notice him pause, briefly, beside the boy wedged against the hull, checking that the older hand's improvised watch over him is holding. It costs the quartermaster almost nothing, this small gesture in the middle of chaos. It is, all the same, exactly the kind of thing that makes this crew something more than the armed mob outsiders assume every pirate ship must be. Somewhere in this same stretch of the night, word comes down that the order's been given to start throwing cargo overboard. Not the treasure, not yet, but the bulkier trade goods still riding in the hold. The elephant tusks and bolts of cloth taken as prizes over the past year. Anything that can be spared to lighten a ship riding dangerously low in mounting seas. There's a bitter, almost too perfect irony in it that even exhausted, frightened men can't quite miss. A crew that spent a year risking their lives to accumulate this cargo is now spending the last hours of that same voyage heaving it into the Atlantic by the armful, trading fortune for a few more inches of freeboard and the faint hope those inches might matter. Nobody suggests throwing the coin overboard too, not yet, whether out of superstition, stubbornness, or the simple physical difficulty of hauling 180 50-pound sacks up through a pitching hold in the dark. The money stays where it is, wedged low in the ship that's carrying it toward the very shoal that will finally claim it for good. By 10 o'clock, the storm has stopped announcing itself in stages and simply arrived, in full, all at once, heavy rain driving nearly sideways across the deck, lightning splitting the dark in sheets, bright enough to throw the whole ship into stark silver relief for half a second at a time, followed by thunder close enough to feel in your chest rather than just hear. Below decks, the noise is somehow worse than it would be topside, because you can't see any of it, only hear the hull groaning under stresses it was never built to survive night after night. Only feel the ship pitching in ways that no amount of time at sea has fully prepared your stomach for. Here's the thing nobody tells you about genuine fear at sea. It doesn't look like panic. Not at first. It looks like silence. The usual chatter and grumbling that fills this hold on an ordinary night has gone almost completely quiet. 100-odd men listening to a ship they've trusted for months begin, audibly, to struggle. Somewhere near you, a boy who can't be more than 11 or 12, one of several genuinely young crew members documented among this fleet's diverse company. Boys who'd signed on or been taken aboard the way boys often were in this era, too young by any modern standard for what they're about to face, has stopped pretending not to be frightened. Nobody mocks him for it. An older hand nearby, without much ceremony, shifts himself so the boy is wedged between him and the hull, offering nothing more than proximity and the small, wordless promise that proximity implies. It's not much. On a ship where kinship is built from shared risk and a signed contract rather than blood or long neighbourly acquaintance, it might be the closest thing to tenderness this hold has to offer tonight, and it matters more for how little it costs to give. 11:15, and the rhythm of the ship under you has changed in a way your whole body registers before your mind fully processes it. Less a rolling motion now than a series of hard, flat slaps. The hull meeting each wave less like a vessel cutting through water, and more like something being struck, again and again, by something considerably larger than itself. You grip whatever's nearest and hold on, the way everyone around you is holding on. 100-odd men and boys braced in the dark against a violence none of them can see coming until it's already arrived. Somewhere above, you can hear men shouting orders that the wind tears apart before they can travel more than a few feet. Fragments of commands, a name called out and answered. The specific frantic energy of sailors trying to save a ship they already suspect, on some level, might not be savable. Relief that it isn't you up there right now doing that work lasts about as long as it takes you to remember that up there and down here are, on a sinking ship, a distinction with a much shorter shelf life than you'd like to believe. Past 11, the wind's pitch has climbed again, and now you can hear something new underneath it. A deep rhythmic pounding that takes you a moment to place, because you've never heard it from this vantage point before. It's surf. Close surf, the kind that means shallow water. The kind that means land is somewhere nearby in a night with no visibility at all to confirm exactly how nearby. A voice from the companionway relays what the men on deck can barely make out through the driving rain and the dark, breakers off the bow, and no clear water beyond them. On a ship of this size, in conditions like these, that report should be terrifying. What's almost worse is how calmly it gets passed along. Men too exhausted by the sheer physical work of the last 2 hours to spend what little energy remains on panic, saving it instead for whatever comes next. At some point past midnight, you hear Bellamy's voice itself, carrying down through the companionway in fragments the storm keeps tearing away before they reach you whole. No dramatic speech, nothing worth quoting. Just a captain doing what a captain does in the last salvageable minutes of a disaster, calling instructions to men who are already past the point where instructions can save them. It's worth noting plainly here, without embellishment, no eyewitness account of Bellamy's exact final words survives, and anyone who tells you otherwise is filling a gap the historical record simply never closed. What we do know, from the wreck's position and the pattern of what washed ashore in the days that followed, is that whatever orders were given in these final minutes came too late to matter. The ship was already past saving. The only real question left was how many of the men aboard her would be past saving along with her. Past midnight, the mainmast begins making a sound you'll remember if you survive tonight. For the rest of your life, a deep tearing groan, wood fighting a strain no amount of careful maintenance was ever going to fully prepare it for. Thomas Davis has stopped tapping planks entirely. There's no more use in it. Whatever verdict his careful, patient inspections were meant to deliver, the ship herself is delivering it now, in a language considerably louder and considerably less patient than his. What happens in the next few minutes is going to decide, with brutal finality, which of the 146 men crowded into this hold tonight get to walk away from this story at all, and it happens too fast, in the dark, for almost any of them to see it coming until it's already underway. The mainmast of the wider galley snapped sometime around midnight on April 26, 1717, with a crack loud enough to carry over the storm itself. And in the few minutes that followed, a 300-ton galley that had survived a 3-day chase, a full refit, and roughly a year of raiding 200 miles of Atlantic coastline, came apart in the surf less than 500 feet from a beach. Nobody aboard her could see. She had struck a sandbar bow first in shallow water off what is now Marconi Beach in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and the same waves that had been battering her hull for hours now finished the job in a matter of minutes, rolling her, breaking her back, scattering 146 men and a fortune in stolen coin across a stretch of freezing, churning Atlantic that, in late April, still carries the deep cold of a New England winter that hasn't fully released its grip. This is the story of the last 5 minutes of the wider galley, the fastest ship on the Atlantic, undone in the time it takes to read this sentence twice. The numbers here are worth stating plainly, because vague language does a disservice to what actually happened. Most careful modern accounts put the wider's complement at around 146 men that night, though contemporary testimony from surviving crew members gives figures running as high as 180, and no single tally has ever been fully reconciled. A reminder that record keeping aboard a pirate ship, even one that ran on written articles, was never going to match the precision of a naval muster roll. Of that number, only 2 men survived the wrecking of the wider herself. Cyprian Southhack, the government surveyor sent to investigate in the storm's aftermath, would later report burying 102 drowned men on the beach near the wreck site, bodies that had washed ashore in the days following the disaster, while as many as 40 more, by some estimates, were never recovered at all, pulled out with the wreck itself into deeper water, or buried by the same shifting sands that would go on to hide the ship's remains for the next 260 years. Water this cold works fast against a man in it, storm or no storm, hypothermia alone, layered on top of the physical trauma of a ship breaking apart around him, would have ended most of these men's lives within minutes of hitting the water, whether they could swim or not. Among the handful who did survive, 2 names recur across every surviving account of that night. Thomas Davis, the Welsh ship's carpenter who had spent the voyage tapping seams by lantern light, and John Julian, a Mosquito Indian pilot from the Central American coast, said to have been around 16 years old at the time of the wreck. How, exactly, either man survived a disaster that killed roughly 140 of their shipmates isn't fully documented. The surviving record doesn't give us a clean narrative of Davis clinging to wreckage or Julian being thrown clear by a particular wave, and it would be dishonest to invent one. What the record does confirm is that both men were found alive on or near the beach in the wreck's immediate aftermath, half drowned and freezing, having survived odds that killed nearly everyone around them. Davis, a forced man who'd been pressed into this life against his will, would go on to argue exactly that point in a Boston courtroom within the year. Julian would never get the chance to argue anything at all. But that part of the story belongs to what comes after tonight, not to the wreck itself. Roughly 4 miles south of where the wider went down, a second wreck was unfolding in parallel, and its outcome couldn't have landed more differently. The Mary Ann, the wine-laden Pink, captured just that same morning, crewed by 7 of Bellamy's men and carrying 6 prisoners taken from her original crew, had lost sight of the flagship in the same fog that scattered the whole fleet that afternoon, and by the time the storm hit in full, she was running blind near what is now Norset Light. close enough to a small island offshore that when she finally grounded, hard, in the dark, every single soul aboard her survived. Thomas South, the forced carpenter who'd spent the evening quietly calculating his odds of swimming ashore, never had to make that swim after all. The storm that killed nearly everyone on the Wider left every man on the Mary Ann alive, wet, frightened, and very much still in custody of a fortune in captured Madeira that by morning would matter to absolutely no one. It's the kind of detail that resists tidy meaning. The flagship carrying the treasure and the captain went down with almost total loss of life, while the wine ship, carrying nothing more valuable than casks of Madeira and a handful of prisoners, delivered every man aboard her safely to a beach. Fortune, that night, had nothing to do with fortune. To put this single night in context, the Wider's loss stands, even measured against 3 centuries of maritime disaster along this same stretch of coastline, as the deadliest shipwreck Cape Cod has ever recorded. The outer arm of the cape has claimed hundreds of vessels over the centuries. The shifting sandbars around Chatham and Pollock Rip alone account for a dense concentration of wrecks going back to the earliest colonial shipping, most recently and famously the SS Pendleton, which broke apart offshore in 1952 and prompted the largest small boat rescue in the history of the United States Coast Guard. None of those later disasters, for all their own drama and loss, matched the sheer scale of death visited on a single ship in a single night back in 1717. A hurricane-force storm, a heavily overloaded galley, and an unfamiliar stretch of shoal water combined that night into something the Cape's long, grim catalogue of wrecks has never quite repeated since. There is a version of what happened in those first hours that Cape Cod folklore has never quite let go of, and it deserves to be named honestly as folklore rather than history. Stories persisted for generations afterward of a mysterious figure glimpsed near the wreck site in the weeks and months that followed. A man who appeared and vanished among the dunes, sometimes described as a survivor gone half mad, sometimes as something considerably less ordinary. The essayist Henry David Thoreau, walking this same stretch of coast more than a century later, recorded local traditions about strange figures haunting the outer Cape's wrecking grounds, evidence less of anything supernatural than of how thoroughly a disaster this large embeds itself in a community's collective memory, resurfacing for generations as story long after the facts themselves have blurred. No court record, no contemporary letter, no piece of physical evidence supports the idea of a third survivor beyond Davis and Julian. What the persistence of the legend does support is something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. A community that watched 100 bodies wash up on its beaches in a single week needed somewhere to put that horror beyond simple burial, and stories about ghosts on the dunes are one of the places grief this large has always gone. The 2 confirmed survivors fared very differently from each other in those first disorienting hours, and the difference tells you something uncomfortable about who this era's legal system considered fully human. Thomas Davis, found alive and reportedly still in shock, was treated, eventually, as a prisoner with a defence to offer, a forced Englishman who would get his chance to argue in a courtroom that piracy had never been his choice. John Julian, 16 years old and indigenous, received no such consideration. He was taken into custody not as a man awaiting trial, but as property awaiting disposal, and within a relatively short span of time would be sold into slavery rather than granted so much as a hearing. 2 boys, because Davis too was young by any modern reckoning, pulled from the same freezing surf, walking away from the same disaster into 2 entirely different fates, decided not by anything either of them had done, but by what the colonial world of 1717 was prepared to recognise as a person deserving a trial at all. Dawn on April 27th broke over a stretch of Cape Cod shoreline that local residents would remember for the rest of their lives. Bodies had begun washing ashore before first light, along with wreckage, cargo, and, this is the detail that changed everything about what happened next, coin, real coin, silver and gold, scattered across miles of beach by a wreck that had, within hours of going down, already begun spilling its fortune onto the sand for anyone willing to wade in and claim it. It's worth putting a rough figure to what was actually at stake here. Even allowing for the imprecision of any 300-year-old estimate, contemporary testimony describes something in the neighbourhood of 180 sacks of coin aboard the Wider at the time she went down. Each reportedly weighing about 50 pounds, a haul some later reckonings have placed at upward of 4.5 tons of silver and gold combined, considerably more temptation than any government proclamation, however sternly worded, was ever likely to keep off a public beach. Word travels fast along a coastline that depends on the sea for its livelihood, and by the time Cyprian Southhack arrived on the government's business roughly 10 days later, he found, by his own account, some 200 people from as far as 20 miles distant already combing the wreck site and the surrounding shore, salvaging whatever the tide had given up. Cape Cod folklore has a name for men who made a practice of this kind of opportunistic beachcombing, mooncussers. So called because a bright moon that lit the shoreline for honest salvage was, to men hoping to work unseen, something worth cursing rather than welcoming. Whether any of them deliberately lured ships onto the shoals, as later legends sometimes claimed, is far less documented than the plain fact that once a ship wrecked here. The shore itself turned into a competing claim nobody in authority could realistically police. For the families living along that stretch of Wellfleet and Eastham shoreline, the week that followed the wreck was less a treasure hunt than a slow, grim tide of the dead. Bodies continued washing ashore for days after the storm itself had passed, and it fell to local residents, not soldiers, not officials, simply the men and women who lived nearest the beach, to do the work no government proclamation had yet arrived to organise. They dug the graves. They said what words seemed appropriate over men whose names, in most cases, nobody present could have told you. Pirates and forced men alike reduced by the sea to the same anonymous condition. Buried in what was almost certainly a mass grave somewhere along that shoreline, one whose exact location has never been definitively rediscovered even by modern archaeology. It is worth pausing on that plainly. Somewhere beneath the dunes of what is now a national seashore, 100-odd men who once argued over shares and voted on their own captain are very likely still resting in ground nobody has ever marked with their names. Because in most cases, nobody left alive ever knew what those names were. Governor Samuel Shute, working from Boston, had dispatched Southhack specifically to recover whatever treasure and armament could be salvaged for the Crown, along with instructions to see to the burial of the dead. Instructions that arrived, in practice, too late to matter on either count. By the time Southhack reached the wreck site, local authorities had already handled the burials. He was presented, by his own later account, with a bill from the local coroner for services already rendered, the grim logistics of 102 bodies having simply outpaced any government response slow enough to arrive by land and sea from Boston. The treasure fared no better. Southhack's own report described the ship's riches and guns as already buried in shifting sand beyond any hope of full recovery, and the map he drew of the site, later published as part of his New England coasting pilot, would become, centuries later, one of the very few tools available to anyone hoping to find the wreck again. For now, though, in the spring of 1717, the Wider galley was simply gone, her captain drowned, her treasure scattered between the ocean floor and several hundred private pockets up and down the Cape, and her surviving crew, the 2 men off her own decks, and the 9 total counting the Mary Ann's prize crew and prisoners, already in the hands of authorities who had a very particular kind of justice waiting for them. What happened to those 9 survivors over the months that followed would turn out to matter almost as much to this story as the storm itself, because surviving a hurricane, it turns out, was only the first of several ways this night could still end badly for the men who lived through it. The sea had already decided who got to keep breathing. Now it was the colony of Massachusetts Bay's turn to decide who got to keep living. You're marched off the beach still half frozen, wrists bound, surrounded by local men who a week ago would have called themselves neighbours to nobody aboard your ship, and now find themselves, without much ceremony, your captors. There's no dramatic standoff in it. You're in no condition to run, And even if you were, there's nowhere on this stretch of sandy coastline to run to. The relief of simply being alive, actually, genuinely alive, when so many of the men you sailed with hasn't fully caught up with you yet. It will. Right now there's only cold, and rope, and the long walk toward whatever comes next. The journey itself takes days rather than hours, overland and by small boat along a coastline you'd normally have covered in a fraction of the time under sail, except that now you're cargo rather than crew, moved at the pace of whoever's guarding you rather than any wind you'd have chosen. You pass through towns whose names mean nothing to you, watched by people whose curiosity you can feel even when you can't see their faces clearly, the specific attention reserved for a man who is, depending entirely on how the coming months go, either a condemned criminal or a very lucky survivor. Nobody along the way seems interested in which of those two things you'll turn out to be. They're simply interested in looking at you either way. By early May you've been transported to Boston and delivered into the town's gaol, a cold stone building that, compared to the freezing surf you nearly died in 2 weeks earlier, ought to feel like an improvement, and somehow doesn't. Word has already spread through Boston about the wreck. 100-odd pirates drowned off Cape Cod, a fortune scattered across the beach, and now a handful of survivors delivered into custody to answer for a year of raiding up and down the American coast. You're a curiosity as much as a prisoner. Here's what nobody warns you about being famous for the wrong reasons. Strangers come simply to look at you through the bars, the way people might gather to see something washed up after a storm, which, in a fairly literal sense, is exactly what you are. The gaol itself does its own slow work on you over the weeks that follow, the way confinement always does. There's little ventilation, less light, and a diet that makes the Wider's weevil-riddled biscuit look, in retrospect, almost generous by comparison. Disease moves through a crowded colonial jail the way it moves through any crowded space, with poor sanitation and worse ventilation. And more than one prisoner awaiting trial in Boston that year never lived to hear a verdict at all, felled by fever or dysentery rather than by any rope. You spend a great deal of this waiting, simply listening, to other prisoners, to guards, to the muffled sounds of a busy port town going about its ordinary business just beyond stone walls that have made you, for the first time in your adult life, someone with absolutely nothing to do but wait for other people to decide your fate. On a pirate ship, whatever else was true of it, you had a vote. Here, you don't even have that. Somewhere in your first weeks in that cell, a visitor arrives who isn't there merely to gawk. Cotton Mather, the most prominent Puritan minister in Boston, and a man whose sermons carried real weight across the colony, begins making regular visits to the imprisoned pirates, not to torment them by most accounts, but to save them in the specific theological sense that mattered most to him, securing confessions, urging repentance, preparing condemned men's souls for whatever came after the noose, regardless of whether their bodies could be saved from it. Mather would go on to publish an account of these visits and this case, a pamphlet aimed at using your crime as a moral lesson for the living. You don't know that yet. Right now he's simply a stern, learned man asking you, gently but relentlessly, to account for how you came to this life, and whether you're sorry for it. Congratulations, you've survived a hurricane only to spend your evenings being catechized by the most persistent minister in New England. There are worse ways to spend a jail sentence. There are also, you're beginning to suspect, worse things than a jail sentence waiting at the end of it. Thomas Davis is housed not far from you, along with Thomas South, the Mary Ann's forced carpenter who never did make his swim for shore, and, in the strange calculus of that storm, never had to. The two men have become something like companions in the weeks since the wreck, bound by the particular grief that survivors carry, not guilt exactly, though there's some of that too, but a kind of disbelief that keeps circling back on itself. The same question asked a dozen different ways. Why them, and not the man who'd tapped twice on the plank beside their own the week before? Davis, you gather from the little he says, still thinks sometimes about the way the mainmast sounded in its last minutes, the specific pitch of it, a sound he says he can't quite get out of his ears even now, weeks later, in a stone cell, nowhere near the sea. Neither man talks much about what comes next. There isn't much comfort to be found in doing so. This trial and the public execution that follows it aren't happening in a vacuum. Either, colonial authorities up and down the American coast spent this same stretch of years prosecuting piracy with a new and deliberate severity, part of a broader crackdown that would, within another year or two. Also claim men sailing under captains like Stead Bonnet and Bartholomew Roberts, whose own crews faced strikingly similar admiralty proceedings in other colonial ports. The Crown's patience with the golden age of unchecked Atlantic piracy was visibly running out by 1717, and trials like this one, public, well publicised, deliberately staged as spectacle as much as justice, were part of the machinery by which that patience translated into policy. Your trial isn't simply about what you personally did aboard the Wider. It's a small piece of a much larger colonial project to make an example loud enough that other sailors, weighing the same desperate choices that put half this crew aboard a pirate ship in the first place, might think twice before making the same one. By mid-October, the machinery of colonial justice has finally caught up with the paperwork. On October 18th, 1717, 6 months and a season removed from the wreck itself, the surviving pirates are brought before a court of admiralty in Boston to answer formally for piracy and robbery on the high seas, a proceeding considerably more organised and considerably less merciful than anything most of the defendants had ever experienced aboard a ship governed by their own signed articles. The court hears testimony about the year's raiding, about the Wider's capture, about the wine taken off the Mary Ann on the very last morning any of this mattered. 6 men are named and tried together: John Brown, a sailor from Jamaica, Thomas Baker and Hendrik Quintor, both from the Netherlands, Peter Cornelius Hoof, from Sweden, a man recorded as John Schwan, from France, and Simon van Voorst, from New York. The court finds all 6 guilty and sentences them to hang, a verdict that, whatever else it says about colonial justice, at least confirms something the record has already told us about who actually sailed under Bellamy's flag. Not a crew of Englishmen alone, but a genuinely international company of sailors from at least 5 different nations, judged now by a single colonial court under a single colonial law. The courtroom itself, when your turn finally comes, is nothing like the deck of a ship where disputes got settled by open vote among equals. This is a room built entirely around hierarchy, judges seated above, spectators packed along the walls, a formal proceeding conducted in the dense legal language of a colonial admiralty court, with witnesses called to testify about specific acts of robbery on specific dates against specific vessels. You listen to your own year at sea narrated back to you in terms you barely recognise. Every capture that once felt like ordinary fleet business now itemised as a separate criminal charge. Every division of shares under the articles now presented as evidence of premeditated conspiracy rather than the closest thing to fair labour practice this crew ever had. It's a strange, disorienting experience, hearing the system you lived inside for a year translated into the language of the system that's about to judge you for it. Thomas Davis and Thomas South are tried separately from the other 6, and their defence turns on the single argument that has mattered from the moment they were first taken off captured vessels months earlier: that they never chose this life at all. That they were forced men, conscripted carpenters whose skills made them too valuable to release, and whose consent was never meaningfully asked for. It's a defence the court remarkably accepts. Both men are acquitted, released not because the year of raiding somehow didn't happen, but because the court is persuaded that neither man had any real choice in whether it happened around him. It's worth sitting with what that verdict actually validates, an admission built into the machinery of the law itself. That piracy in this era ran partly on coercion, that a crew's articles and votes and equal shares existed alongside men who'd never willingly signed anything, kept aboard by simple necessity rather than by any oath they'd freely given. Davis and South walk out of that courtroom alive. What either man did with the rest of his life afterward isn't recorded. No surviving document follows either carpenter beyond this trial, and it would be dishonest to invent an ending for men history simply let go of. On November 15th, 1717, the 6 condemned men are led out to a public execution on Boston Common, beneath what accounts describe as the town's Great Elm, a site already well established as the place where the colony carried out its most serious sentences. The hanging draws a crowd numbering, by contemporary accounts, in the thousands, men, women, and children turning out for a spectacle that colonial authorities intended, quite deliberately, as a warning rather than mere punishment, a public demonstration of exactly what happened to sailors who chose piracy over honest service. Cotton Mather accompanies the condemned men to the gallows, praying with them in their final minutes, having spent the intervening months trying to secure precisely the kind of repentance that, in his theology, mattered more than the men's earthly survival ever could. The 6 bodies are left hanging afterward, per the grim custom of the era, a visible lesson for any sailor passing through Boston Harbour who might otherwise be tempted to try his own hand at the trade. You're not among the 6, whether you're standing somewhere in that crowd of thousands, having been released alongside Davis and South, or whether your own part in this story ended somewhere back on that beach in April. The men going to the gallows this morning are, in a real sense, the last ones still paying a debt the sea already tried to collect once. Peter Cornelius Hoof, John Brown, Thomas Baker, Hendrik Quintor, John Schwan, Simon van Voorst, 6 names from 6 different corners of the Atlantic world, Sweden and Jamaica and the Netherlands and France and New York, bound together for one final morning by the same signed articles that once divided their shares equally, now standing equally condemned under a very different kind of law. It's worth remembering, watching this, that these were the same men who once had a vote. They don't have one today. Nobody does, in front of a gallows. There's one more fate worth stating plainly before this part of the story closes, because leaving it out would flatten exactly the injustice this chapter has been circling. John Julian, 16 years old, a Mosquito Indian pilot, who survived the same freezing surf that killed nearly 140 of his shipmates, never stood trial at all. Rather than facing the same court that acquitted Thomas Davis and Thomas South on the forced man defence, Julian was simply sold into slavery, his labour and his life disposed of as property rather than adjudicated as a man's. Some later historical research has suggested, tentatively and with real uncertainty, that a John Julian sold in this period to a Massachusetts family with ties to the ancestors of a future American president may be the same John Julian who once piloted the wider galley through waters he knew better than any chart available to Bellamy's crew, a man who might, by that same tentative account, have met a violent end many years later under entirely different, similarly unjust circumstances. The identification isn't fully confirmed, and it's presented here exactly as cautiously as the historical record actually allows. What is confirmed, without any need for caution at all, is this: of the 2 men who survived the actual wrecking of the wider galley, one got a courtroom and one didn't, and the difference between them had nothing to do with what either man had done, and everything to do with who the law of 1717 was prepared to consider a person. The men were judged, sentenced, and in most cases hanged within a year of a storm that had already killed nearly all of their crewmates outright. What survived all of it? The wreck, the trial, the gallows. And 260 years of shifting Cape Cod sand was the ship herself, waiting quietly at the bottom of the Atlantic for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to come looking. For 260 years, that's all the wider galley was, a story. A name in Cotton Mather's pamphlet, a smudged notation on Cyprian Southac's hand-drawn map, a scattering of half-believed legends about witches and ghosts, and buried gold along a stretch of dunes that kept right on shifting, year after year, burying whatever the storm hadn't already claimed a little deeper with each passing decade. It would take the better part of 3 centuries, and one particularly stubborn underwater explorer, before anyone found out how much of that story was actually still down there, waiting. Barry Clifford grew up on Cape Cod, hearing about the wider the way generations of local children had, as bedtime legend treasure hunter bait. The kind of story every beach town along that coastline seems to keep in reserve for tourists and grandchildren alike. Most people who hear that story once, as adults, file it away exactly where it seems to belong, alongside buried gold and ghost ships, colourful but almost certainly untraceable. The specific wreck site lost to shifting sand and 2.5 centuries of imprecise record-keeping. Clifford did something almost nobody else who'd heard the same childhood story ever did. He spent years combing archives for anything that might narrow the search, old maps, colonial correspondence, and, most crucially, the surviving copies of Cyprian Southac's own 1717 chart, the one drawn in the storm's immediate aftermath, marking the spot where a government surveyor had once buried 102 drowned men. In 1984, working off that centuries-old chart and years of painstaking research rather than any lucky guess, Clifford's team located wreckage buried under Wellfleet's shifting sands, in shallow water not far offshore. This is the story of what came up out of that sand over the following decades. Proof that a legend Cape Cod had been telling itself since 1717 turned out, this whole time, to be sitting on solid, recoverable fact. It's worth being honest about how much skepticism preceded that success, because the search wasn't the tidy montage a modern documentary might make of it. Popular imagination tends to picture pirate treasure the way Robert Louis Stevenson taught generations of readers to picture it, a map with a literal X, a chest buried under a specific palm tree, a single afternoon's digging separating a lucky adventurer from a fortune. Southac's actual 1717 chart offered nothing nearly so convenient. It gave Clifford's team a general stretch of coastline and a rough sense of where a government surveyor had once stood, nothing more, and even armed with that lead, locating scattered wreckage buried under as much as 50 feet of constantly shifting sand required years of systematic magnetometer surveys, painstaking underwater grid searches. And the specific stubbornness of a man willing to keep looking long after most reasonable people would have concluded the ship was simply gone for good. Academic and archaeological circles greeted the initial claims with the caution such claims usually deserve, given how many amateur treasure hunters before Clifford had announced discoveries that turned out to be nothing more than ordinary period wreckage with an exciting story attached. The 1985 discovery of that inscribed bell is what finally converted skepticism into consensus, proof, in solid bronze, that this particular stretch of Wellfleet sand really had been keeping the promise Southac's map made 268 years earlier. Finding wreckage in the right general location was one thing. Proving, beyond reasonable doubt, that this particular scatter of 18th century debris actually belonged to the wider galley specifically, rather than to any of the dozens of other vessels lost along this same treacherous stretch of Cape Cod coastline over 3 centuries of maritime traffic, was another matter entirely. That proof arrived in 1985 when divers recovered the ship's bell from the wreck site, a solid, unglamorous object that turned out to be the single most important find of the entire expedition, because someone, back in a London foundry in 1716, had cast an inscription directly into the bronze, the wider galley, 1716. It's hard to overstate what that inscription actually settled. Bells don't lie, and bells don't drift far from the ships they were cast for. A bell with a ship's name and launch date cast directly into its surface is about as close to a signed confession as underwater archaeology ever gets. With that single object, the wider galley became, and to this day remains, the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck from the entire Golden Age of Piracy ever positively identified anywhere in the world. Not a probable match, not a best guess based on period and location, but a confirmed named vessel, resting exactly where a government surveyor had marked her down nearly 270 years earlier. The scale of what followed that identification is genuinely difficult to convey in a single figure, so it's worth giving you several. The wreck site itself turned out to be spread across roughly 4 miles of ocean floor, buried under anywhere from 10 to 50 feet of sand depending on location, at depths running from about 16 to 30 feet of water. Shallow enough to work, deep enough, and covered by enough constantly shifting sediment that recovery has remained slow, painstaking work for 4 decades running rather than a single triumphant salvage operation. More than 200,000 individual artifacts have been recovered from the site since Clifford's team began working it, ranging from cannon, more than 60 and counting, with 2 recovered in a single 2009 dive, weighing 800 and 1,500 pounds respectively, down to the smallest, most quietly devastating personal items, buttons, buckles, pistols and coins, from at least a dozen different countries of origin. A physical inventory of just how far this ship's plundering had actually ranged across the Atlantic world before that April night ended it. Here's a detail that deserves to land with its full weight rather than being rushed past. In 2018, divers working the site recovered a human leg bone, and subsequent examination gave researchers reason to believe it might belong to Samuel Bellamy himself. A possibility, not a certainty, and one the archaeological team has been careful to describe with appropriate scientific caution rather than sensational confidence. It is, whichever way the eventual identification lands, an almost unbearably intimate find, after 3 centuries of Bellamy existing mostly as legend, Robin Hood nickname, disputed quotation, and folklore romance with a woman whose own existence isn't fully documented. Here was something inarguably physical, a fragment of an actual body that once belonged to an actual 28-year-old man who drowned, along with nearly everyone he commanded, within sight of a shore he never reached. Then, in 2023, archaeologists working the wreck recovered something even more sobering: 6 separate sets of human remains, found preserved inside dense concretions, rigid masses that form underwater around metal and organic material alike, 1 complete skeleton and portions of 5 others, some bones fractured, likely from the same violent capsizing that ended so many lives in a matter of minutes back in 1717. Researchers at the museum housing the collection have spoken openly about hoping modern forensic techniques might someday help identify these men and, where possible, reconnect them with living descendants, turning what began as a story about vanished pirates into, potentially, a story about family members finally accounted for after 300 years of simply being missing. None of this recovery happened without conflict, and it's worth being honest about that too, because the story of who gets to profit from a wreck like this one turned out to be almost as fraught, in its own smaller way, as the story of who got to profit from her cargo back in 1717. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Clifford's expedition spent years in legal dispute over ownership and salvage rights to the site, the state arguing broadly that a wreck of this historical significance belonged under public stewardship, Clifford's team arguing that the years of privately funded research and recovery work that had actually located and preserved the site earned them the right to continue it. The dispute eventually resolved in terms that granted Clifford's team ongoing exclusive rights to excavate and study the wreck, under formal agreements with the Commonwealth that continue to govern the site's careful, incremental recovery to this day, with artifacts catalogued, conserved, and in many cases ultimately displayed for public education rather than sold off into private collections. It's a strange fitting echo of the ship's entire history, a vessel built by one set of legal claims, stolen by force from another, and finally recovered under a third. Ownership, it turns out, has never once been a simple question where the wider galley is concerned. What all of this recovered material eventually became is a museum, the wider Pirate Museum on Cape Cod, where visitors can walk past actual cannon, actual coin, actual personal effects pulled directly from this specific wreck, rather than the generalized pirate lore most museums are forced to work with in the absence of authenticated material. Its most distinctive feature is what staff call a wet lab, a working conservation space where visitors watch marine archaeologists and conservators actively cleaning and stabilizing newly recovered artifacts in real time. Not a static diorama of pirate history, but history still, quite literally being pulled out of the sand and cared for as you watch. It's the kind of exhibit that makes the distance between 1717 and the present feel, briefly, very thin indeed, the same tar and bilge smell this whole story opened with. The same hold where a Welsh carpenter once tapped nervous fingers against timber he no longer trusted, reduced now to careful trays of cleaned metal under laboratory light. 4 decades into a recovery effort that isn't finished yet, and, by every indication, won't be for decades more. Here's what an authenticated wreck like this one actually does for the historical record. Beyond the simple thrill of confirmed treasure, it corrects the popular imagination in ways no amount of retelling ever could on its own. Popular pirate mythology, built largely on 19th and 20th century fiction rather than 18th century fact, has trained generations of audiences to picture peglegs, parrots, buried treasure maps, and men forced at sword point to walk a plank into the sea, almost none of which shows up with any real frequency in the actual documented record of Golden Age piracy, the wider included. What does show up, again and again, in the artifacts and the testimony and the court records this wreck has helped confirm, is something considerably less cinematic and considerably more interesting written articles, votes, guaranteed compensation for injury, and a crew drawn from at least half a dozen nations and several different racial and legal backgrounds, bound together not by a shared homeland or a shared flag, but by a shared signed contract and a shared willingness to risk everything under it. The Wider's hold, recovered piece by piece out of Wellfleet sand, has turned out to be a far better history lesson than any pirate novel ever managed. Proof that the real story was, in its own quiet way, stranger and more genuinely radical than the legend. It's also worth sitting, for a moment, with just how much of this story remains genuinely unfinished. 4 decades of steady excavation have recovered more than 200,000 artifacts, and marine archaeologists working the site today will tell you without much hesitation that the job is nowhere close to done, that significant portions of the wreck almost certainly remain buried under sand nobody has yet had reason or resources to move, that identifications of individual remains are ongoing, that new finds still surface with enough regularity to keep a full-time conservation staff working in that wet lab, year after year, cleaning objects that spent nearly 270 years being slowly reclaimed by the Atlantic before anyone thought to look for them. There is something genuinely humbling in that scale of patience. A wreck that took 260 years to find in the first place is by any reasonable measure going to take considerably longer than a single research team's career to fully understand. The Wider Galley isn't a closed case. She's an open one, still being worked, 4 decades in and counting. It's worth ending this part of the story where it began, with the uncomfortable, unresolved tension the Wider has carried since before she ever flew a black flag. She was built to profit from human suffering on an industrial scale, sold 312 enslaved people into bondage on the single voyage that made her famous enough to steal, and then, in her second and far shorter life, became a vessel that offered a small number of escaped and formerly enslaved men something closer to equal footing than almost anywhere else in the Atlantic world of 1717 would have extended them. Both of those facts are true of the same 300 tons of London-built timber. Neither cancels the other. What the wreck site preserves, and what the museum now displays, isn't a clean story about pirates and treasure. It's a genuinely complicated one, recovered piece by careful piece out of the same Cape Cod sand that swallowed it whole on a single violent night in April of 1717. And that complexity, as much as any coin or cannon pulled from the wreck, is probably the most valuable thing anyone has recovered from her yet. Somewhere off Wellfleet tonight, in water no deeper than a swimming pool, 300 tons of stolen slave ship are still settling a little further into the sand, exactly the way they have been for 309 years. Exactly the way they'll likely keep doing for a good while yet. The bell that once hung near her helm sits behind glass in a museum now, cleaned of 3 centuries of tarnish, still bearing the same 4 words a London founder cast into her in 1716, the Wider Galley. It outlived every single man who ever slept in her hold. It outlived the storm. It outlived the trial and the gallows and 260 years of Cape Cod locals half believing their own grandparents' ghost stories. It's still here. That's the part worth sitting with, on a night like this one. Somewhere in that same recovered wreckage is, quite possibly, a fragment of Samuel Bellamy himself, the self-made pirate king who was voted into command rather than born to it, who dressed better than most Boston merchants and drowned worse than most Boston beggars. 28 years old and 500 feet from a shore he never reached. Thomas Davis and Thomas South walked out of a Boston courtroom alive. Two forced men the law, for once, believed. What either of them did with the decades still ahead of them was never written down. But they got decades, which is more than 140 of their shipmates can say, and more than John Julian, 16 years old and sold rather than tried, ever should have taken from him in the first place. A carpenter's careful, patient tapping, twice for a plank he trusted, 3 times for one he didn't, turned out to be the last honest warning this ship ever received. Nobody could have stopped what came after. He gave it anyway. You're warm right now, in a bed the Atlantic has never once threatened to take from you. You're dry. Nobody is asking you to vote on your own captain, or pump water against a losing tide, or tap a plank in the dark and hope it lies to you kindly. That was one storm, off one stretch of sand, nearly 310 years ago, and somewhere down there tonight, it's still quiet. The hold is still. The bell doesn't ring anymore unless someone lifts it. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.